Powers of Horror, an essay on objection is a 1980 book by Julia Kristeva. Approaching Abjection is the first chapter of the book. Julia Kristeva is a Bulgarian French philosopher, literary critic, semiotician, psychoanalyst, feminist, and most recently novelist who has lived in France since the mid 90s. Her major works include Powers of Horror, Tales of Love, and the trilogy Female Genius. Her sizable body of work include books and essays that address intertextuality, the semiotic and abjection in the fields of linguistics, literary theory and criticism, and psychoanalysis. She is also a prominent figure in structuralism and post-structuralism. Powers of Horror. The work is an extensive treatise on the subject of abjection. Abjection, the term literally meaning the state of being cast off, in which Kristeva draws out the theories of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan to examine horror, marginalization, castration, the phallic signifier, the Oedipal complex, exile, and the other concepts appropriate to feminist criticism and queer theory. The first chapter, Approaching Abjection, in the text, the abject referring to the human reaction to vomit or horror is a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the loss of the distinction between subject and the object or between the self and the other. The primary example of what causes such a reaction is the corpse mean dead body, which dramatically reminds us of our own materiality. However, other items can elicit the same reaction: the open wound, sewage, even the skin that forms on the surface of warm milk. Okay, the essay appears to simultaneously interrogate and refigure the concept of the object within the realm of psychoanalysis and its philosophical underpinnings. As mentioned, the object is a pivotal concept, and Kristeva offers a number of perspectives on it. It passes through a number of conceptual viewpoint briefly through, though incisively. Kristeva decides to write about that which it has been repressed, of that at which one does not want to look or smell or experience: the skim of milk, fingernail parings, waste, and so on. She contrasts the object to the object, which is connected to the Freudian mechanisms or process of repression, denial, and repudiation that are part of the formation of the human subject. She explains. Kristeva examines that the notion of abjection, the repressed and literally unspeakable forces that linger inside a person's psyche. The object, expressed through the grotesque, the gross, and the physically challenging, has long been a source of innovation and scandal in the art world. For Kristeva, abjection accounts for much of the complexity of the human conditions. She understands abjection to encompass various aspects of our humanity that are often seen as conceptually and or experientially desperate: emotions, embodiment, affect, repression, criminality, hygiene, etc. According to Julia Kristeva, the best of modern art and literature, including Dostoevsky, Proust, Artaud, Kafka, and Celine, explore the concept and places of the object. The object is the reaction to the breakdown of meaning created from the collapse of the distinctions between the self and the other. The object refers to the thing which disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, these being anything from a heinous and disturbing crime to corpse, especially of a loved one or a relative, as well as an open wound, sewage, and even the skin that forms on the surface of warm milk. These things expose death's materiality. Death not in a symbolic or meaningful framework, but that death infecting life, literally showcasing the insistent insistent materiality of death. Continually in this essay, Kristeva makes reference to images of bordering between the subject and the object, the self and the other, whether merely symbolic in the skin of the surface of the milk or real as in the transition of a living being to the corpse, literally in the collapse of subject into object and the loss of identity to pure materiality. One of the chief features of the object is its ambiguity. It is somewhere between being an object and not being an object. However, it should be noted that it has nothing to do with the object itself. There is not something about the object which makes it into a pseudo object, as Kristeva says. The object, in short, is a kind of non-object that lingers in person's psyche the consequences of repression. In order to understand why the object is not an object, one must understand the postmodernist theory of language that Kristeva subscribes to. Rather, classify something as an object or not an object is something that is done through the language of the subject. A person relates to his or her world through language. Kristeva believes that the entire world, including oneself, is understood through language. It is the only lens, so as to speak, by which we can understand anything. Kristeva firmly within the postmodernist literary and linguistic movement. Postmodernism is largely founded on the insight of a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure developed a theory of language according to which meaning was the result of difference and exclusion. A sign, like a word, has meaning only if it does not mean something else. For example, cat has the meaning that it does not because it is not it has the meaning that it does because it is not any other word. Structuralists believed, however, that there was some ultimate foundation for language which gave the entire system meaning. Postmodernism rejects this last belief. They believe that language is fundamentally completely arbitrary and that there is no final ground of meaning. Instead, language is purely a social construct, as they believe that language is the only way one can understand the world. Kristeva believes that the only way one can relate or understand the world is through the medium of language. Anything that is completely non-linguistic is literally unintelligible. There are several important consequences of this theory. First, since language is not private entity but rather the product of a society, language transmits the ideology of society. Since one understands the world through language, it is therefore impossible to see the world in an unbiased way. One is always seeing the world through a set of biases and prejudices that one inherited from society. Another consequence of this is that make understand the radically different cultures and societies difficult, if not impossible. If two cultures have radically different languages, then they have radically different ways of understanding the world. One is not born speaking, rather, language is a gradual development during the course of one's childhood. Simultaneous with this linguistic development are several crises which Kristeva borrows largely from the psychoanalytic work of Sigmund Freud. Most important of these crises is the Oedipus complex, in which the child begins to lust for his mother but is unable to have her because of his father. The Oedipus complex is a recurring idea in the book. Kristeva's philosophical heritage is composed primarily of postmodernism and Freudian psychoanalysis. Her work is largely a continuation of the project begun by Jacques Lacan, and others apply the linguist insight of postmodernism in the psychoanalytic method of Freud. It is important then to realize that Kristeva is not a pure Freudian. Indeed, she explicitly disagrees with him several times in the book. Nonetheless, any reading of the text will immediately reveal that she is nonetheless much indebted to his work. One of the most important Freudian insight Kristeva uses is the Oedipus complex. According to Freud, when a child, particularly a boy, grows up, he begins to have sexual desire to his mother. Ultimately, he resigns himself to the fact that he will never have his mother and repress the desire for her. As this complex is largely pre-linguistic, or at least before the linguistic ability have fully developed, the lingering, expressed remnants of his lust continue to linger in the soul, but they never gain the substance of expression. Kristeva argues that the object exerts a tremendous psychological impact on individual and indeed on societies as a whole. Religion is a natural response to the object, for it is truly experience of the object. He is prone to engage in all manners of perverse and antisocial behaviors. Therefore, religion creates a buffer between one's mind and the object and further represses them. Kristeva follows Freud in her belief that repressed desire tend to manifest themselves unconsciously and symbolically. This can happen occasionally in something like the slip of a tongue, the so-called Freudian slip, but it also happens in art. Indeed, art is indispensable but investigating to object because its non-linguistic nature prevents it from ever being directly expressed. And the essay further develops as her Kristeva's on psychosexual development. Kristeva follows the general parameters of Lacan's model of psychosexual development. However, she adds number of elements that recast the balances of Lacan's time. In particular, Kristeva offers a more central place for the maternal and the feminine in the subject of psychosexual development. For this reason, she has been particularly influential on feminist psychoanalysis, looking for a less sexist and phallocentric model of the subject. The Kristeva's variations on Lacanian theme, according to her, the 0 to 6 months of age in the child's infant's development. Kristeva refers to this stage as the chora. In the earlier stage of development, you are dominated by the chaotic mix of perceptions, feelings, and needs, and you did not distinguish your own self from that of your mother or even the world around you. Rather, you spent your time taking into yourself everything that you experienced as pleasurable without may acknowledgement of boundaries. This is the stage where then when you were closest to the pure materiality of existence, or what Lacan terms the real stage. At this stage, you were, according to Kristeva, purely dominated by your drives, both life drives and the death drives. And the next, the 4 to 8 months of age, Kristeva posits that between the chora and the mirror stage occurs a crucial pre-linguistic stage that she associates with the object. During this time in your development, you began to establish a separation between yourself and the maternal, thus creating those boundaries between self and the other that must be in the place before the entrance into language. The object confronts us, on the other hand, and this time within our personal archaeology, with our earliest attempts to release to the hold of maternal entity even before existing outside of her, thanks to the autonomy of language. It is a violent, clumsy breaking away with the constant risk of falling back under the sway of a powerful securing its stiflings. Like the subject's confrontation with death, the threat of falling back into the pre-linguistic stage of chora strikes the subject with fear and horror because it means giving up all the linguistic structure by which we order our social world of meaning. Kristeva sees the stage of abjection as precondition of narcissism, which is to say a precondition for the narcissism of the mirror stage, which comes next. 6 to 18 months of age, this age which Lacan terms the mirror stage, was a central in the development. The mirror stage enlists a libidinous dynamism caused by the young child's identification with his own image, what Lacan terms as ideal I or ideal ego. This recognition of the self-image proceeds to the entrance into language, after which the subject can understand the place of that image of the self within the larger social order in which the subject must negotiate his or her relationship with the others. This ideal I is important precisely because it represents on the subject a simplified, bounded from the self, the opposed to the turbulent, chaotic perceptions, feelings, and needs felt by the infant. In particular, this creation of an ideal version of the self gives pre-verbal impetus to the creation of fantasies in the fully developed subject. It establishes what Lacan terms the imaginary order, and through the imaginary continues to assert its influence on the subject even after the subject enters the next stage of development. Kristeva offers a different spin on Lacan by emphasizing the fact that the stage is preceded and troubled by the subject relation to the object. Abjection is therefore a kind of narcissistic crisis. 18 months in to 4 years of age, the acquisition of language during the next stage of development further separated you from the connection to the real. Lacan builds on such semiotic critics as Ferdinand de Saussure to show how language is a system that makes sense only with its own internal logic of differences. The word father only makes sense in terms of those other terms it defined with or against. Once you entered into the differential system of language, it is forever afterward determined your perception of the world around you, so that the intrusion of the real materiality becomes a traumatic event, albeit on quite common since our version of reality is built over the chaos of the real. Kristeva adds to the Lacan her sense of the language is ultimately a fetish and effort to cover over the lack inherent in our relation to death, materiality, and the object. It is perhaps unavoidable that when a subject confronts the facetiousness of object relation, when he stands at the place of the want that founds it, is the fetish becomes a life preserver, temporary and slippery, but nonetheless indispensable. But it is not exactly language our ultimate and inseparable. But is not language exactly our ultimate and inseparable fetish? According to Kristeva, the object refers to the human reaction, a horror, vomit, to a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the loss of the distinction between subject and object, or between the self and the other. The primary example for what causes such a reaction is the corpse, which traumatically reminds us of our own materiality. However, other items can elicit the same reaction. Kristeva's understanding of the object provides a helpful term to contrast to Lacan's object of desire, or the object petit a, whereas the object petit a allows subject to coordinate his or her desires, thus allowing the symbolic order of meanings and intersubjective community to persist. The object is radically excluded, and as Kristeva explains, draws me towards the place where meaning collapses. It is neither object nor subject. The object is situated rather at a place before we entered into the symbolic order. As Kristeva puts, abjection preserves that existed in the archaism of pre-objectal relationship, in the immemorial violence with which a body becomes separated from another body in order to be. The object marks what Kristeva terms primal repression on that precedes the establishment of the subject's relation to its object or desire and of representation, before even establishment of the opposition, conscious, unconscious, or unconscious. Kristeva refers instead to the moment of in our psychosexual development when we establish a border or separation between human and animal, between culture and that which precedes it. On the level of archaic memory, Kristeva refers to the primitive effort to separate ourselves from the animal. By way of objection, primitive societies have marked out a precise area of their culture in order to remove it from the threatening world of animals or animalism, which were imagined as representatives of sex and murder. On the level of our individual psychosexual development, the object marks the moment when we separated ourselves from the mother, when we began to recognize a boundary between me and other, between me and mother. The object is a precondition of narcissism, which is to say a precondition for the narcissism of the mirror stage, which occur after we establish the primal distinctions. The object thus at once represents the threat that meaning is breaking down and constitutes our reaction to such a breakdown, a re-establishment of our primal repression. The object has to do with what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, and so on. Can also include crimes like such crimes are abject precisely because they draw attention to the fragility of the law. More specifically, Kristeva associates the object with the irruption of the real into our lives. In particular, she associates such a response with our rejection of death's insistent materiality. Our reaction to such abject material rechanges what is essentially prelingual response. Kristeva therefore is quite careful to differentiate knowledge of death or the meaning of death, both of which can exist within the symbolic order. From the traumatic experience of being actually confronted within the sort of materiality that traumatically shows you your own death. A wound with blood and pus or the sickly, acid or smelly of wet of decay does not signify death. In the presence of a signified death, the corpse especially exemplifies Kristeva's concept since it realizes the breakdown of the distinction between the subject and object, which is crucial for the establishment of identity and for our entrance into the symbolic order. What we are confronted with when we experience the trauma of seeing a human corpse is our own eventual death made palpably real. As Kristeva puts it, the corpse seen without God and outside of science is the utmost of abjection. It is death infecting life object. The object must also disguise from desire. It is associated rather with both fear and in phobia. Kristeva reads the trace of pre-linguistic confrontation with the object, a moment that precedes the recognition of any actual object of fear. The phobic object shows up at the place of non-objectal states of drive and assumes that all the mishaps of drive as disappointed desire or desire diverted from their objects. The object of fear is Abject mother and Cora. For Kristeva, the object is part of one's personal archaeology of or buried consciousness. Abjection is part of the earliest and forgotten struggle to separate from the mother who is reluctant to recognize the realm of the symbolic or the law of the phallus. Before the intervention of the symbolic, there is a prior impulse compelled to expel the mother and the mother becomes the object. But the symbolic alone is not enough to ensure the separation. In order for the child to become detached from the mother must be objected. The object world thus be the object of primal repression. The mother is gradually rejected through rituals of cleanliness, toilet training, eating habits and so on. Though this lesson is a horror, the mother is objected in signifying horror. Reconciliation with the maternal body is possible. The human subject is founded upon the imposition of the symbolic law of the father and the abjection of the mother to prevent incest. Inspired by the rejection of the maternal body, the prohibition of incest include and is located in what Kristeva, borrowing a term from Plato, called the Cora. Imagine the Cora as a receptacle, a place where the repressed is pent up. The Cora will of course return, but it is held in tennis check by the sign of the image of the subject formed narcissistically of itself. As a result, the object is a crisis of narcissism, Kristeva asserts. Kristeva asserts that the sex and violence form the primal intersection of humanity, and women are the victims of the symbolic order. The murder of the mother and the prohibition of incest is the precondition of the emergence of human subjectivism and the formation of society. The division or separation of mother and the child makes up the two sides of the sacred. This would be no sacred if it were not the ritual murder performed symbolically to prevent incest. For the mother to not be the object of desire, she must be objected and associated with menstrual blood, hair and bodily waste. Maternal milk binds the child to the mother and becomes a sign of incest. Because pollution outside the body threatens the identity of the body, these extensions of the body renders the body indistinct and ambiguous, and the body must be subject to ritual acts to ward off defilement. John Lecter points out in his book on Julia Kristeva privileges menstrual blood and excrement which stem from the maternal or the pre-symbolic. This object not controlled by the symbolic but by energy drives. Abjection becomes internalized through language and spoken through the symbolic order. Object and literature. Within the Lacanian framework, the object is a central waypoint to the definition of the relation of the personal ego with the greater world. It is not just the presence of disgust or horror, but that entire gamut of suffering we encounter. Kristeva later notes that the object is, for Dostoevsky, the object of the possessed. It is the aim and motive of an existence whose meaning is lost, absolute degradation, because it absolutely rejected the moral limit as absolute God. Therefore, the objection is the fulcrum, is which we use as our compass of moral regulation by default. Kristeva opens Powers of Horror with a general overview of what she may be the term objection and how the object and the process of objection differ, plus a slight introspection into the history of the object as a socio-cultural phenomenon, covering with strong insights such aspects as how early Christian mystics delighted in the object and how the concept of self-abuse and piety evolved in a part from the view of the objection. Kristeva is careful to clarify the differences between the grotesque and the object, and how the object can share in such material corpses of thing which causes disgust but also transcended such a base emotional reaction.